Pathetic deaf, mutes, the harmonic commander sneered, stroking his command console with haughty elegance. Their entire civilization was built on the flawless foundation of molecular resonance. Any weapon striking their translucent crystalline ships was instantly transmuted into a harmless, melodic chord. To them, a human nuclear warhead was nothing more than a slightly louder bass drum. Having severed the power grid of the Earth fleet, they were preparing to pulverize humanity's internal organs with a symphony of the end. Backed into a corner aboard the Earth flagship, the old captain powered down all the useless quantum weapon control panels. Turning around, he dug out an ancient analog audio player with hardwired cables and hundreds of massive physical speakers from the depths of the cargo hold. "Since they love a good tune," the captain muttered, shoving in his earplugs and ripping the volume knob completely off. "Let's treat them to some homegrown Earth death metal." Frank bore down on his wrist, the red-hot welding tip fusing the rusty red hull of the hammer. Blue-white sparks showered down, burning a trail of sizzling, smoking holes into his oil-stained overalls. Half his body hung off the open deck. A pair of heavy-duty industrial noise-canceling earmuffs hung around his neck, their frayed leather edges caked in welding ash. Half of a flattened cigar dangled from his lips, the wrapper long since wrinkled by the interstellar winds. A mere 100 meters away, 12 crystalline dreadnoughts of the Harmonic Empire sat perfectly arrayed. Their translucent, high-density crystalline hulls cast a soft, pearlescent glow in the starlight. Every power surge bled off as a crisp, melodious, high-frequency hum, like a free cosmic concert. The Harmonic Commander's sickeningly elegant, high-frequency voice drifted over the public comms channel, dripping with undisguised mockery. "Primitive carbon-based lifeforms, did you humans scrape together this pile of scrap metal from a junkyard to provide background music for the Empire's sacred ceremony?" Frank ignored him. He pulled back the welding gun, scraped the slag off the tip, and delivered a vicious kick to the man-sized giant speaker at his feet. The heavy iron casing slammed against the ship's hull with a dull, heavy thud. Grabbing a thick copper cable, thicker than his own arm, he jammed it into the terminal block, snatched up a wrench, and cranked it down tight with a pair of loud clanks. A flurry of greenish copper rust rained down on his calloused hand. That was the last one. From bow to stern, a total of 16 massive mechanical speakers had been personally welded dead to the hammer's outer hull by him. The row of pitch-black, rusted iron barrels lined up neatly, facing off across the docking bay against the pristine, crystalline dreadnoughts. They looked incredibly vulgar, like a filthy drunk stumbling into a black tie gala. Frank looked up, scanning the blindingly bright crystal hulls across the way. A roguish smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he spat out the cigar stub he'd been chewing on all day. Tossing the wrench into his tool bag, he yanked the filthy towel off his neck to wipe the welding ash from his face, then turned and climbed down the scaffolding. He headed down the rusty gangway and into the cockpit. The heavy hatch slammed shut and locked behind him with a loud clang. Plunking himself down into the cracked, peeling leather of the old command chair, he reached for the metal flask on his belt. But out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement across the docking bay. The quantum weapon control screens across the entire human main fleet simultaneously erupted in a blinding storm of static. And in the distance, at the heart of the Harmonic flagship, a basketball-sized crystal core had quietly ignited with a dangerous, pale blue halo. There were no alarms, no red warning lights of lasers warming up. Just invisible, high-frequency harmonics silently washing over the entire human fleet formation via the quantum comms network. The quantum weapon consoles on the human fleet were the first to blow. Hundreds of integrated capacitors were breached in milliseconds by the ultra-high frequency waves. Blue-white electrical fires erupted from the bridge windows of ship after ship. The acrid stench of scorched insulation surged through the hammer's ventilation ducts and into the cockpit, tightening his throat. The quantum navigation screen in front of Frank flickered one last time before the glass shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. The scalding circuit board smoked, billowing thick, black clouds. In an instant, every networked quantum device on the ship flatlined into total darkness. Only the ancient, purely mechanically driven gas turbine at the bottom of the ship remained. Laboring under the strain of idling, it ground out a dull, heavy roar, the single piece of core propulsion still functioning in the entire human formation. A public comms window from the harmonic flagship abruptly popped open. The commander's crystal face was smooth and freezing cold, utterly devoid of emotion. His synthesized voice was as flat as a priest reciting a prayer. Inferior carbon-based barbarians, your childish energy technology has long been completely analyzed by the sacred crystals. Every device reliant on quantum electronics is merely a conduit for your destruction. Drop your weapons, fall to your knees, and surrender. Accept assimilation into the Empire, and your species will be spared. Frank cracked his neck with a stiff pop. He wiped the sweat from his chin, grabbed the metal flask off the armrest, unscrewed the cap, and took a massive swig of burning single malt. The whiskey ran down his collar and into his oil-stained overalls. He looked out the window at the distant human fleet. The first silent fireball had already blossomed over a destroyer's bridge. The blinding glare cut through the vacuum and lit up the hammer's cockpit, making Frank squint. The steel toe of his combat boot was already resting firmly on the edge of a loose, old metal floor panel in the cockpit. Outside, silent, dark red explosions detonated in rapid succession. The human fleet's quantum gear was completely fried, expanding into fiery spheres one after another. The flames cast an orange glow through the bulletproof glass, illuminating his soot-covered stubble. His oversized earmuffs rested around his neck. The Harmonic Empire's surrender broadcast fizzed through the scorched quantum comms, laced with a rhythmic, high-frequency trill, "Drop your weapons and surrender. All your energy weapons are useless against the sacred crystals. Resistance is futile." Frank popped the stopper off his flask, tilted his head back, and downed another fiery gulp of whiskey. The liquor trailed down his chin and soaked into the collar of his greasy overalls. He flexed his white-knuckled grip, shifted his weight to his right leg, and engaged his core, driving his heavy steel-toed boot out in a vicious kick. Clang, crack. The old panel's rivets sheared right off. The half-century-old rusted metal flipped into the air and slammed onto the deck. Years of accumulated dust and oil mist billowed up, making Frank narrow his eyes against the grit. He bent down and reached into the hidden compartment. His massive, calloused hand clamped around the freezing metal casing of a box. With a hard yank, he pulled out an old, school analog signal audio player, coated in gray sludge. The chipping paint on the metal shell still faintly bore the faded stencil of an Earth rock band. He slammed the player onto the console, reached back into the cubby, and hooked his fingers around a coil of thick black rubber-coated copper wire. Pulling hard against the wall of the compartment, he dragged the heavy coil out. The stiff wires clattered onto the steel deck, knocking over half a crate of canvas, wrapped cassette tapes, and revealing a pair of shiny, hardened steel pliers resting at the very bottom. Another shockwave from an explosion swept over the hammer. Chunks of debris fell from the cockpit ceiling, bouncing off Frank's shoulders. He shoved the half-empty flask back into his pocket, wiped the dust from his stubble, and spat out a mouthful of booze-tinged rust. He could still hear the comms, endlessly droning its surrender pitch. His fingertips brushed the rough rubber of the copper wire. Leaning forward, he reached down into the bottom of the compartment toward the resting pliers, a vicious, whiskey-fueled grin spreading across his face. His knuckles grazed the crumbling, rusty edge of the compartment. Frank's rough hand seized the wooden handle of the hardened steel pliers, its cold, heavy weight settling firmly into his palm. With a flick of his wrist, he yanked the pliers out. Rust flakes rained down onto the warped steel floor, clattering sharply in the smoke-filled air. Outside the window, shredded human hull plates skimmed past the hammer's turbine casing. The comms channel was swamped with the harmonic commander's arrogant, metallic, resonating voice, gloating that all human quantum weapons had been melted down by the harmonics and promising intact corpses for an immediate surrender. Frank spat a glob of whiskey, laced saliva at the comms unit. He strode over to the melted, blistered main console. Aligning the sharp jaws of the pliers with the tangled mess of charred quantum cables, he squeezed his wrist hard. Snap. The entire row of fused wiring severed instantly. Carbon ash spilled onto the floor, crunching like dry leaves. He grabbed the coil of heavy rubber-coated copper wire at his feet and used the pliers to strip the casing off both ends, exposing the bright yellow copper. He shoved the bare wire directly into the terminal block wired to the external speaker array, clamped the jaws onto the retaining screws, and cranked them down tight. Snipping off the excess wire, a rogue strand whipped out and slashed a shallow cut across his hand. He didn't even blink. Turning around, he kicked aside the canvas-covered crate of cassettes, dug through it with his calloused hands, and snatched up a death metal cassette with a worn, faded plastic casing. He lifted it and slammed it hard into the slot of the old analog player. Click. The tape seated perfectly, the spools locking right into the drive mechanism. All circuits were completely connected. Frank let go of the tape. He pressed his rough thumb against the player's cold metal volume knob, raising his other hand toward his collar to grab the oversized industrial earmuffs. With a sharp slap, he clamped the earmuffs over his skull. The tight band pressed his graying hair flat against his sweaty, greasy forehead. The motion shook free a drop of blood from the cut on his hand, leaving a tiny, wet splat on the peeling metal floor of the cockpit. The harmonic Vanguard commander was still glowing arrogantly on the comms screen, his translucent crystal face locked in a genetic sneer. The final line of his surrender demand lingered on the screen. Surrender immediately. All your energy attacks will be converted into the Empire's sacred notes. I will allow your civilization an intact corpse. Frank grinned, flashing tobacco-stained yellow teeth, and didn't say a word. He violently cranked his wrist down. Crack. The metal knob snapped loudly, tearing right through the limiter pin and jamming dead at the absolute maximum volume. The dusty analog player shuddered with a hum. The faded death metal cassette began turning at a steady pace, and the first rib shattering ultra-low frequency bass drop instantly exploded. The analog current in the heavy copper cables hummed and thrashed. The entire gas turbine, powered hammer, vibrated in sympathy, shedding sheets of rust from the hull seams. Outside the hull, the entire array of massive, welded-on physical speakers blasted at once. Every 20-meter-wide speaker cone vibrated violently, displacing the air inside the ship's outer atmospheric envelope. Visible shockwaves of distorted air gathered into spheres through the cannon, like array openings. Riding on chaotic, brutal, low-frequency vibrations and pure physical kinetic energy, it charged like an unleashed iron beast toward the harmonic Vanguard fleet hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. The harmonic commander hovered on his bridge, arms crossed. He even laughed as he ordered the Vanguard fleet to deploy their invincible crystal shields, preparing to absorb humanity's final amusement and transmute this unknown vibration into a triumphal anthem for the Emperor. His perfect crystalline structure contained zero warning protocols for low-frequency physical vibrations. He couldn't even sense the invisible, iron, shattering tidal wave of tearing force until it violently slammed against the outermost edge of the shields. The heavy, physical tremor backwashed through the thick copper lines right into the hammer's keel. Loose old rivets rattled free from the bulkheads, pinging to the floor and rolling to a stop by Frank's feet. But he just leaned against the console, completely still under his massive industrial earmuffs. Only the black welding slag on his boots trembled slightly with the ship. His thumb rested on the maxed-out volume knob, casually wiping away a layer of dust. On the bridge of the Harmonic Vanguard command ship, a chaotic flicker of light suddenly rippled across the smooth, crystalline face of the commander who had been sneering at the comm screen just moments ago. According to the Empire's eons, old laws of war, any energy attack striking the sacred crystal armor would convert into a melodious royal hymn. But this time, the energy conversion circuits were dead silent. Instead, an unbearable, irregular itch crawled up the ship's hull and into every molecular seam, vibrating the luster right out of his crystal fingertips. The flawlessly perfect crystal shield, which had reflected starlight like a solid block of ice, visibly began to warp and contort. The uniform index of refraction twisted violently, bulging into irregular lumps like glass squeezed by an invisible hand. First, pinprick-sized white fractures appeared on the shield's surface. Then white cracks snaked madly along the molecular bonds. In the span of just 3 heavy bass drops, the entire 1,000-kilometer-wide shield fractured into a dense, spider-webbed mess. With every passing wave of low-frequency vibration, the cracks widened. Tiny crystalline shards flaked off the fractures, spiraling out into the freezing vacuum of space. The alien soldiers inside the command ship descended into chaos. Their crystalline feet couldn't grip the polished floors, and they fell sprawling across the corridors. Hairline fractures opened up across the bodies of several troops, triggering panicked, high-frequency shrieks. The commander gripped his control stick tight, his crystal eyes wide with sheer, disbelieving panic. In the millions of years of his civilization's military history, the concepts of physical impact and irregular, low-frequency vibration simply didn't exist. He couldn't even comprehend what was happening. The heavy bass rumbled, each wave heavier than the last. Cracks covered the entirety of 3 Vanguard dreadnoughts, every inch of crystal armor frantically shaking loose debris. The next crescendo of drum beats hung right in the air. And then, the massive drum drop hit. Pure, low-frequency kinetic shockwaves smashed past the critical resonance threshold. Like an invisible 1,000-ton hammer, it swept violently through the entire Harmonic Vanguard formation. On the lead dreadnought bearing the commander's flag, the web of cracks across its crystal hull violently burst open. Dense fissures consumed the entire vessel at a visible rate. The perfectly ordered crystalline molecular chains snapped inch by inch under the chaotic, low-frequency thrashing. There was no exaggerated nuclear fireball. Instead, a cascading, crisp shattering of glass ripped outward on the shockwave. The 12-kilometer-long dreadnought acted like tempered glass struck by a sledgehammer, instantly exploding into a massive, flying spray of crystal debris. It glittered blindingly under the cold light of the nearby star, spreading into a 10-kilometer-wide cloud of crystalline dust. Less than 3 seconds later, the 2nd and 3rd Vanguard dreadnoughts disintegrated in sequence. Not a single piece of wreckage was larger than the palm of a hand. It was nothing but shattered glass, mingled with the blown-apart crystal bodies of the aliens, tumbling wildly through the cosmic vacuum. The Harmonic Vanguard commander's scream leaked through the intercepted public comms. This isn't an energy attack. What kind of filthy dark magic is this? Our sacred crystals are immune to all energy. His voice cut out abruptly as he and his entire bridge were vaporized into dust. Frank leaned back against his greasy metal console, tapping his fingers in time with the roaring bass. His heavy, ear-muffed head bobbed twice to the beat. The remaining 10 or so Vanguard ships were already a total mess, frantically turning hard to flee. But the moment they brushed even the tail end of the ultra-low sub-bass wave, chunks of crystal cascaded off their hulls. Their once immaculate formation collapsed completely into shambles, and the comms channel drowned in incoherent, panicked alien shrieking. Frank rubbed his stubbled chin, spat out the plug of tobacco he'd been chewing on, and sank it dead, center into the rusty bucket in the corner of the deck. He lifted his knobby hand and clamped it firmly onto the cold steel handle of the gas turbine's thrust lever. The deafening roar of the turbine instantly rattled the old cockpit windows. Boiling mixed exhaust blasted from the rear nozzles into the void, churning through the drifting crystal shrapnel of the harmonic dreadnoughts. The thrust propelled the rugged steel hull of the hammer forward like a cannonball, punching straight into the gap left by the routing enemy fleet. The sub-base outside the ship never let up for a second. The death metal drumbeats relentlessly pumped through the hardwired cables into the array of massive physical speakers on the hull. Visible, distorted shockwaves pushed out ahead of the bow, forming a half-kilometer wide, shattering plowblade. Any ship wreckage foolish enough to drift into its path instantly fractured, disintegrating into fine white powder before it even touched the hull. The surviving commanders of the crippled harmonic ships frantically mashed high-frequency distress signals on their screens. They were so terrified that 3 hairline fractures had already cracked open across one commander's own crystalline chest. They pulled Max. G turns to evade, but the moment they entered the low-frequency kill zone, the flawlessly ordered sacred crystal molecules went completely haywire. The ships disintegrated from the keel up, bursting one after another into fresh showers of debris. Frank leaned back in his pilot's seat, completely deafened by his industrial earmuffs. He could only feel the brutal bone, shaking vibration of the ship. Resting near his foot was the base beat that had shattered the first enemy shield. Flicking a stray shard of crystal off his console, he locked his eyes dead on the eerily glowing crystal, hued home planet sitting on the forward star chart. The hammer plowed headlong through a hailstorm of debris, shattering the Vanguard's blockade line. The gas turbine blades were glowing cherry red. Speed pushed to the absolute design limits. The void, carving shockwave brutally tore open a pitch, black corridor straight through the wrecked battle zone to the homeworld. 1,000,000 kilometers, 500,000, 100,000. The silhouette of the crystal homeworld grew sharper. Fractures from the shockwaves were already visible on the edges of the blue, glowing crystalline planetary shield covering the atmosphere. Frank licked his cracked lips. His right hand was already resting on the console's frequency switch lever. In the distance, hundreds of neat cold lights flared up along the edge of the homeworld's atmosphere, drifting slowly upward through the troposphere. The roaring gas turbine shook the cockpit floorboards. The hundreds of cold lights at the atmospheric edge accelerated rapidly. The pale blue glow tore through the thin upper atmosphere, revealing hundreds of sharply angled crystal fighters. Every crystalline wing shimmered with high-frequency resonance, flying in a formation more perfect than a ruler could measure, diving straight toward the charging hammer. Wearing his heavy industrial earmuffs, Frank leaned half his weight on the console. His rough knuckles dragged across the chipped paint as he spat a wad of oil-tainted chewing gum into the empty tin bucket at his feet. The radar screen was so jammed with red blips that the edges glowed. The lead crystal fighters had already leveled their crystal cannons. Pale blue, high-energy harmonics pooled at the muzzles. The resonant frequency of the entire fleet was as perfectly synchronized as a single individual, just waiting to hit the trigger and shred this flying heap of scrap metal. They would never understand why humans would weld hundreds of ugly iron megaphones all over the hull of a ship. Their dictionaries simply lacked crude words like physical impact or irregular low frequency. They believed only that perfect high-frequency harmonics could melt down any intruder. Frank flashed a wide, tobacco-stained grin. His rough hand locked tightly onto the chipped red lever on the control board. The analog current in the heavy copper cables tripped with a violent hum. The blasting death metal drums were instantly cut. Hundreds of massive paper cones inside the physical speakers suddenly sucked inward. The entire hull of the hammer seemed to contract with them, the building air pressure causing the paper cones to snap and pop with tiny tearing sounds. The lead alien commander finished his power cycle. Pale blue high-energy harmonics locked dead onto the hammer's cockpit. The crystal airframes of the entire interceptor fleet flared brilliantly at once, waiting only to unleash that first beam of energy. Veins popped in Frank's arm. With a brutal downward snap of his wrist, he yanked the red lever all the way to the bottom. The paper cones of hundreds of exterior speakers violently blasted outward. Half a second of violently pent-up air pressure pushed a deafening, agonizingly sharp mechanical air raid siren. Like countless cold, forged steel spikes, the sound stabbed directly into the immaculate formation of crystal fighters. The crystal wing surfaces of the front line fighters instantly began to shudder uncontrollably. Their perfectly precise resonance levitation frequencies were instantly bashed to a pulp. The alien pilots' comms channels erupted in chaotic high-frequency screaming. From birth, they had only known ordered molecular resonance. They had never encountered such savage, chaotic physical vibration. Every crystal linkage in their flight controls vibrated into powder within 3 seconds. The first fighter abruptly dived, its wing cleanly shearing into its wingman. A chain reaction of concussions ripped right through the pristine interceptor formation. Hundreds of crystal fighters lost their balance one after another, like dominoes toppling. The sharp shattering of crystal fuselages colliding bled through the ship's hull into the cockpit. Even through his heavy industrial earmuffs, Frank could hear the endless cascade of muffled thuds. Frank leaned back in his scratched-up pilot seat, a half-smoked cigar clipped between his fingers. He didn't even bat an eye. In the void a few hundred meters away, the out-of-control fighters plummeted into the atmosphere one by one, dragging long tails of fire before smashing into the ground and kicking up massive, towering plumes of dust. Not a single craft made it within 100 meters of the hammer. The entire impenetrable aerial interception grid was wiped completely clean in half a minute. Frank stubbed out his cigar in a dented aluminum ashtray on the console, then reached out and threw the gas turbine throttle wide open. The rugged freighter let out a roar that rattled the very bones of the ship. Smashing through the atmosphere on a dead straight trajectory, it dove directly for the broadcast center floating above the harmonic homeworld. Friction baked the hull cherry red and flakes of outer paint peeled away, leaving a long black debris trail in its wake. Frank adjusted the earmuffs sliding down his head. His fingertips brushed the crystal dust clinging to the console's edge. He stared at the cold, white, gleaming dome of the broadcast center growing rapidly in the viewport. The blazing nose of the ship was perfectly locked onto the crystal dome, supposedly capable of surviving a megaton nuclear strike with less than 1 second to impact. Boom! The burning bow of the ship, carrying the 10,000-degree residual heat of its gas turbine, slammed dead center into the broadcast center's protective crystal dome. The dome, already laced with fractures from the incoming low-frequency shockwaves, exploded instantly. 10,000 tons of shattered crystal rained down on the central hall below like a monsoon. The entire hammer, riding terminal velocity, punched clean through the roof. Its rear engines still spewing bright orange flames, it smashed brutally onto the polished, off-white crystal floor. The apocalyptic impact rocked the entire structure 3 times, shaking half-meter thick slabs of crystal loose from the walls and ceiling. Momentum threw Frank forward. His left hand clamped onto the edge of the console. His industrial earmuffs stayed perfectly sealed, blocking out the deafening crash. He grabbed the kinetic assault rifle leaning against his seat. His fingers brushed the freezing wooden stock and the shiny brass magazine, shaking off a dusting of crystal shards. He popped his seatbelt, threw his left shoulder against the warped inner hatch, and then raised his leg, driving his heavy steel-toed boot hard into the locked outer airlock door. With a loud crack, the alloy locks sheared off. The half-ton hatch went flying in a shower of sparks, slamming into the crystal wall across the hall and cratering a hole the size of a wash basin. Fissures ran all the way up to the ceiling. Frank vaulted out of the hatch and landed on the floor, his rifle raised and a round in the chamber. The steel spikes on his boots crunched against the smooth crystal floor, stamping out a tiny spiderweb of cracks with every step. Inside the cavernous broadcast hall, hundreds of harmonic personnel stood frozen at their crystal consoles, their translucent bodies shaking uncontrollably. They had never witnessed such a barbaric invasion. No energy barrages, no quantum penetration, just an entire metal ship smashing through their absolutely invincible sacred crystal defenses with pure kinetic force. The words physical impact simply didn't exist in their tactical manuals. Nobody had a clue how to react. Frank spat out the burned-down stub of a cigar dangling from his lips. The glowing red cherry hit the crystal floor, burning a stark black scar into it. He looked up, locking eyes dead on the entrance corridor at the far end of the hall. A blinding, cold, white crystalline glare was already lighting up the corridor. The heavy thrum of boots charging across the crystal floor echoed out as a massive, dark wave of figures rushed down the hallway. In the blink of an eye, the corridor vomited a swarm of white crystal guards. They flooded the open floor of the hall, every last one of them tensing their crystalline bodies in unison. Frank stood on the edge of the ruptured hatch. His steel-toed boot ground down on a thumb-sized chunk of crystal, pulverizing the rock, hard material into fine powder. His left hand pressed down on the headband of his earmuffs. His right hand held the kinetic assault rifle, aimed loosely at the floor. The brass round chambered inside made the action feel tight, and the stock still held the residual heat of the ship's turbine. He swept his gaze over the hundreds of crystal guards blocking the exit, a careless, roguish grin tugging at his lips, shaking the speck of tobacco stuck between his teeth. The front line of crystal guards moved first. Their narrow crystal maws slowly peeled open. They made no sound a human eardrum could catch, but the airborne debris instantly vaporized into dust. The marble, like floor tiles, began shedding powder, and the air itself rippled with visible concentric shockwaves. This was the lethal, high-frequency psychic assault the harmonic species prided themselves on. It could literally vibrate a carbon-based life form's brain into soup. They had already paralyzed the entire human main fleet with this exact trick and thought absolutely nothing of this lone human wielding a fat metal pipe. More and more guards unhinged their jaws. Concentrated high-frequency waves instantly flooded the sprawling central hall. The crystal chandeliers swinging from the ceiling rained glass shards down onto the floor, exploding in showers of white light. Every guard's body hummed with the resonance of their own frequencies. They pushed forward in a steady, unified march, their pristine white surfaces glowing with an arrogant, triumphant light. Frank stood completely still. He even reached up to tweak the noise, canceling dial on his earmuffs. Once he confirmed the seal was tight, he turned his head and spat a glob of brown tobacco juice, landing it dead center on the lead guard's crystal chest. The guard paused for a split second, entirely oblivious to the fact that his lethal attack hadn't ruffled a single hair on his target. Behind Frank, dozens of human marine soldiers raised their kinetic assault rifles in unison, every mag loaded with solid brass rounds. Every single one of them wore identical, heavy-duty industrial earmuffs. The pitch-black muzzles locked perfectly onto the advancing white crystal phalanx. Frank took a step forward. His steel-toed boot snapped the cracked floor tile with a sharp crunch. He leveled his assault rifle. The psychic blast of hundreds of high-frequency shrieks slammed into the human line like a tidal wave. The heavy industrial earmuffs locked every last drop of that high-frequency vibration completely out. The Marine squad remained utterly expressionless, their firing lines perfectly level, matching Frank flawlessly. The perfectly ordered molecular structure of the Crystal Guards wavered. Their databases didn't have an option for ineffective attack, let alone for enemies who actively covered their ears to block resonance. Chaotic waves of panic rippled down their crystalline limbs. The rear guards shrank back involuntarily, their translucent bodies knocking together with tiny tinkling clinks. Frank squeezed the trigger hard. Bang! The first solid brass round shredded the air, smashing right into the lead guard's face. The sacred crystal, capable of transmuting the energy of lasers and nukes, was instantly blown open with a hole the size of a bowl. Spiderweb cracks raced down its torso. The very next second, the humanoid crystal shattered into a cloud of white dust. He didn't let up on the trigger. The assault rifle roared, spitting fire. Red, hot shell casings ejected and bounced off the marble floor, rolling and clinking across half the hall. The Marines opened fire at the same moment. A dense storm of brass lead swept through the Crystal Guards like a scythe through wheat. Every single bullet was a raw, physical impact. There was no energy to convert, just brutal, bone-crushing kinetic shock. The perfect crystal structures shattered like cheap glass against the solid lead cores. Some guards had half their crystal legs blown off, only to be caught by follow-up rounds before they hit the ground, detonating into a fine mist. In 10 short seconds, the hundreds of guards blocking the door had been reduced to a floor full of white gravel, leaving a layer of crystal dust as fine as flour hanging in the air. Frank dumped his empty mag. It clattered into the pile of debris. Backhanding a fresh clip, he slapped it into the rifle with a sharp clack. His steel-toed boots crunched over the mess, grinding large, half-shattered chunks into powder as he marched forward step by step. He looked up. The heavy earmuffs couldn't hide the wild fury in his eyes. Dozens of meters away stood the heavy alloy doors of the core control room. From deep behind those doors, he could already feel an unstoppable high-ranking tremor of absolute terror. Frank dug in his anti-slip boots, now caked in white crystal dust. Channeling all 200 pounds of his body weight into his right heel, he drove a savage kick into the trembling door of the core control room. The heavy alloy door crashed inward with a sharp snap of its hinges. Frank breached first. Assault rifle loaded and raised, the low-frequency rumble of the ship's death metal speakers still thumping dully inside his earmuffs. Behind the control console sat the Harmonic Emperor, his perfectly translucent crystal body rigid. 4 personal guards opened their mouths to launch a psychic attack, but the Marines behind Frank were already pulling their triggers. A dense volley of brass rounds instantly blew the 4 crystalline bodies into clouds of dust that pattered down onto the polished floor. The Emperor had lived for 120,000 years, and for the very first time, a murky terror clouded his crystal pupils. In the billions of years of the Harmonic Empire's history, no enemy had ever touched the core control room. Their sacred crystal armor was immune to all energy attacks. Nobody knew what a physical impact was. The Emperor's crystal knuckles cracked with fine white lines as he flexed them. Mustering every ounce of his strength, he slammed his hand down on the glowing red holographic button on the desk. Every ventilation port around the hall blew wide open. The screech of sucking air pierced the room. Thick rubber seals slammed out of the wall seams, instantly locking down all exits. The absolute silence domain activated. The vacuum extraction system began frantically purging every last breath of air from the room. The low-frequency rumble in Frank's earmuffs faded visibly. A few seconds later, it was dead silent. The crystal shards at his feet tumbled toward the vents, dragged by the rushing air. Overhead explosion, Proof lights flickered wildly from the depressurization, popping in showers of sparks. The young Marine next to him grabbed his throat and dropped to a crouch, coughing violently, every gasp frothing with blood. Frank felt the air being violently ripped from his own lungs. His vision began to darken. He scanned the room and immediately locked eyes on a high-speed buzzing power conduit the size of a bowl, running just under the side of the console, the lifeline of the vacuum generator. Frank dumped his mag on the floor and locked in a fresh one. He flipped the rifle down to his side, letting the heavy, cold steel stock rest firmly in his palm. He slowly lowered his center of gravity, coiling every single muscle in his body tight. On his crystal throne, the Emperor's flawlessly dense sacred body radiated a pale blue, victorious glow. He looked at Frank's flushed, darkening face, his fingertips lightly tapping the armrest. To his mind, this barbaric, low-tech human was about to suffocate and collapse. This rebellion would be crushed to powder, just like every invader before them. Frank held on to his last breath of air and hoisted his fully loaded assault rifle above his head. The forged, solid steel stock felt as heavy as a 1-ton meteor. The dead weight drove down through his arm into his shoulder, completely steady and unmoving. His eyes were nailed to the bowl, thick power pipe in the corner, the Achilles heel of the vacuum generator. He lunged forward, dropped his weight, and brought the stock down with the full, devastating force of his 200-pound frame. The violent recoil numbed Frank's hands. The perfectly cast crystal pipe instantly spiderwebbed with cracks before completely shattering. High-pressure reserve gas blasted out of the breach, flooding back into the hall through the shattered lines. The howling rush of air instantly shredded the absolute silence domain. Gale, force winds whipped crystal debris through the control room. The concussive blast of returning pressure rattled dust from the ceiling. Frank opened his mouth and greedily sucked in a massive lungful of frigid air. His stinging alveoli forced themselves open. He shook the glass shards off his stock and looked up at the throne. The blast of air violently shoved the Emperor into his seat back. With a sharp crack, a half-meter long fissure split down his prized perfect crystalline torso. He gripped the armrest and slid to the floor, gasping heavily. His pale blue aura flickered wildly, totally consumed by a paradigm, shattering terror. Frank threw the rifle back over his shoulder. His boots crunched over the debris as he walked step by step up to the gasping, Emperor collapsed on the floor. Aiming at the galaxy, wide broadcast matrix behind the throne, Frank raised his foot. Frank's steel-toed boot hung mid-air, shedding a flurry of crystal dust from the heel. Slumped in the ruins, the Emperor poured out his last remaining strength, lifting his half-broken arm in a desperate bid to grab Frank's boot. High-frequency energy hemorrhaged from his body, washing over Frank without rustling a single fold of his clothes. The heavy industrial earmuffs walled out every last ripple. Frank paid no attention to the Emperor. He stepped right over him, his hard rubber heel coming down dead on the alien's forearm. With a sickening snap, the entire crystal forearm exploded into white powder. The Emperor let out an agonizing, high-frequency wail no one could hear. His massive frame crashed heavily against the floor, unable to rise again. Frank locked his eyes on the galactic broadcast matrix embedded in the back wall. The half-meter-thick slab of solid sacred crystal was supposedly an absolute defense capable of tanking a solar flare. A quantum cannon wouldn't even scratch it. He adjusted his weight. The slung rifle clattered against his waist armor. Frank twisted his hips, loaded his entire body weight onto his leg, and drove his boot squarely into the center of the panel. A dull boom erupted. Micro-fractures spiderwebbed madly outward from the point of impact, covering the entire slab in an instant. Then, the entire crystal face caved in. Fist-sized chunks rained down on the control board, splattering Frank's goggles with white dust. Frank hitched his rifle up, reached into the hollow cavity, and hooked his calloused fingers around a bundle of insulated energy fiber, optics. Clenching his fist, he ripped it hard outward. The metal retaining clips blew off in sequence. The whole bundle of high-frequency cables came free, live wires sparking wildly and scorching the spilled crystal dust until it smoked. With a flick of his wrist, Frank tossed the bundle at his feet, exposing a pitch, black square core terminal deep inside the cavity. He dropped his right hand down, his rough fingers perfectly snagging the blackened rubber-coated analog audio plug he had hauled all the way from his freighter. The Emperor lying on the floor had no idea what the thick rubber-coated copper wire in Frank's hand was. The entire harmonic tech tree simply never contained the concept of analog signal transmission via physical wire. He opened his crystal mouth and loosed a gut-wrenching high-frequency shriek. "Unplug it! Your inferior garbage is unworthy of the Empire's core terminal. Only quantum-encoded cables can." Frank, locked tight inside his heavy industrial earmuffs, didn't hear a single word. He turned slightly, dropping his steel-toed boot with lethal precision directly onto the Emperor's reaching crystal wrist. With a sharp snap, half the hand crushed into dust. Without even a passing glance at the wildly convulsing Emperor writhing at his feet, he stared through his dusty goggles at the broadcast matrix's core terminal. The original optical cable was gone, leaving a wide-open square port. He lined up the fat copper plug with the socket. The dimensions were wrong. His plug was an entire gauge wider than the factory interface. Frank ground his jaw, gripped his assault rifle tight, and hammered the stock brutally down onto the back of the plug. A heavy thud rang out. The rubber casing scraped against the crystal lip, shaving off a curl of black plastic as the plug jammed forcefully into the port, locking dead in place. The analog electrical signal flowing through the copper wire bled through the terminal into the broadcast matrix. The crystal walls of the core immediately began to hum uneasily, and the floor of the entire control room started to softly vibrate. The Emperor's breath hitched. He could feel the entire planet's broadcast network starting to shake. That chaotic, filthy, low-frequency pulse was currently bleeding through the crystal pipelines, spreading toward every corner of the galaxy. He banged his head insanely against the floor, cracking his own skull. He wailed and begged for it to stop, his shivering crystal body shedding tiny flakes with every tremor. Frank let go of his rifle and raised his rough, calloused thumb, letting it hover solidly over the analog player's source switch. Next to the button was a yellowing piece of masking tape with bold, handwritten letters, "Power drill on chalkboard noise test tape." He cast a sideways glance at the harmonic Emperor paralyzed by the console, the light refracting chaotically through his skin, and brought his thumb violently down. The analog signal flooded madly through the rubberized copper wire, straight into the broadcast matrix core. The crystal lines designed only for perfect high-frequency harmonics were instantly choked with the most chaotic, agonizing, brutally irregular low-frequency static imaginable. It was the single most nerve-shredding noise in the human audio archive, a power drill grinding into a chalkboard. Every vibration was distorted and bent, utterly annihilating the ordered resonance the harmonic civilization had worshipped for 100 millennia. The signal instantly shot up the homeworld's broadcast tower, bursting through the atmosphere. It piggybacked on the harmonic empire's interstellar relay nodes, blanketing every star system under their control in less than a second. Back in the core control room, the first things to crack were a row of crystal knobs on the main console. The fine grains shook for 2 seconds before turning to white powder and spilling off the edge. The Emperor had been desperately clutching his gem-studded crown. The sharp, irregular sound wave slammed right into his perfect crystal body. He looked like his core molecular structure had been impaled by red-hot steel spikes. His entire face instantly twisted in absolute, excruciating agony. Frank leaned against the doorframe, cradling his assault rifle, and watched a half-finger-wide chasm slowly tear open down the back of the Emperor's neck. Clear sap oozed from the fissure, dripping onto the off-white crystal floor. The control room walls vibrated softly. Fine crystal dust constantly drifted down from the ceiling. Outside the window, an endless cascading crunch of shattering echoed up from the homeworld's capital. The agonizing noise had already coated every square inch of the Empire. In a distant star sector staging ground, the Harmonic Empire's immaculately arrayed main fleet was sitting tight. The very first spiderweb micro fracture surfaced on the sacred crystal armor of the lead dreadnought. The crack snaked wildly down the hull, crawling like a living viper over every piece of plating, burrowing into airlocks, penetrating engineering drives, and tearing open the bridge viewports. The fleet admiral standing at the helm couldn't even issue half a distress call. His perfect crystal body split straight down the sternum, blowing apart into countless glass shards that clattered over the controls. In just 3 seconds, the entire 10-kilometer-long dreadnought exploded from the inside out into a massive blizzard of crystal debris. Right beside it, the second and third dreadnoughts received the exact same broadcast noise. A deafening volley of cracking armor rang out as they rapidly disintegrated into cold clouds of space wreckage. Down on the homeworld, Imperial troops charging out of their barracks to reinforce the broadcast center instantly burst with deep fractures across their crystalline skin. The agony threw them collectively onto the streets, writhing and clutching their heads in torment. Along the avenues, crystal office blocks, palace walls, and power spires, every structure cast from sacred crystal, shook madly in the low-frequency resonance. Huge chunks of facade sloughed off, load, bearing pillars sheared along their fault lines, and massive skyscrapers came crashing down, burying the thrashing soldiers alive. Up in orbit, planetary defense batteries snapped to aim, only to fracture down their seams. Unfired energy cores detonated like fireworks. The entire defense network of the Harmonic Empire crumbled to absolute ruin in under 10 minutes. Frank stood slouched in the control room doorway, clad in his massive earmuffs. With his rifle hanging lazily from his left hand, he silently watched the alien Emperor kneeling on the floor. The Emperor's flawless body was totally consumed by deep, spider-webbing scars. The gem-studded crown cracked down the middle, splitting with a clack and smashing to dust on the floor. His murky crystal eyes were wide with sheer, disbelieving despair. Frank stood up straight. Marching forward in his dusty combat boots, he raised his right foot and aimed straight down at the Emperor's arched back and stomped down hard. A brutal snap echoed. The Emperor's already fractured crystal spine broke clean in two. His translucent body tore open with a half-inch wide fissure, and pale blue fluid bled down into the dust covering the control console. The continuous rumble of the collapsing crystal city outside boomed in the background. Debris rained down through the ruptured control room ceiling, clattering against the floor. Frank leaned his entire body weight into it, twisting his old combat boot a savage half-turn, pinning the Emperor dead to the floor. He yanked a buzzing, sparking analog microphone from the edge of the broadcast matrix. Sliding the massive industrial earmuffs down to his neck, he bared his stubbled, oil-stained face, flashing a cold, roguish grin. A crackle of static shot down the fat copper cables, instantly broadcasting across the entire galaxy. Every harmonic crystal structure that hadn't fully collapsed, yet began to vibrate uncontrollably. Listen up, Galaxy. This is Frank from the United Earth Expeditionary Force. Frank's gruff, heavy voice carried on raw, physical sound waves across every planet. The Harmonic Empire is finished. Effective immediately. The first law of physics is now in play. Across all occupied planets, every single building, no matter what it's made of, must be fully padded with human-manufactured rubber shock absorbers before sundown.
The story takes the classic sci-fi trope of advanced alien technology and completely turns it on its head with a massive dose of blue-collar heavy metal grit. It is a fantastic example of using brute force physics to break the rules of a highly advanced, practically magical sci-fi universe. Here are a few standout elements that make the story work so well. The ultimate low-tech victory. The sheer irony of defeating an empire that can absorb nuclear blasts by simply playing a death metal cassette tape at maximum volume is brilliant. It grounds the story in a satisfying reality where basic kinetic energy and physical vibrations are the ultimate equalizer. A perfectly crafted anti-hero, Frank is the epitome of the rugged working-class space marine. From his oil-stained overalls and steel-toed boots to his complete disregard for the aliens' aristocratic monologues, he anchors the story with raw, unapologetic swagger. Sensory storytelling. The author does a phenomenal job of making you feel the story. You can smell the welding smoke and cheap whiskey, hear the deafening silence of the vacuum, and feel the bone, rattling bass of the physical speakers shattering the pristine crystal ships.